Um, the first scandal we wanted to talk about was the 1983 Congressional Page Scandal. This was the year I was born, and the investigation really peaked in 1983, but the incidents occurred back in the early 1970s. And they revolved around two Congresspeople, Representative Dan Crane, who was a Republican of Illinois, and Jerry Studs, who was a Democrat from Massachusetts. And the scandal basically derived around the fact that both Congresspeople had admitted to having sexual relationships with 17-year-old congressional pages. These are folks who work for the congressperson, kind of like a internship type program.
The Speaker, a sad day for the House.
The pages of the House are a trust of the House, a trust of the membership. And when you break that trust, you've done it wrong.
The charges? The Daniel Crane, Illinois conservative Republican, 3 years ago had relations with a 17-year-old female congressional page. That Gary Studs, a Massachusetts liberal Democrat, 10 years ago had sexual relations with a 17-year-old male page and made advances to two others.
Crane with a female page and Studs with a male page. And one of the things that kind of complicated this, and this sort of, I think we'll talk about this with Epstein. Basically, it wasn't a legal scandal because the legal age of consent in DC at the time was 16, but it was more a discussion of kind of ethics and morality. And I think you see this with kind of some of the famous people in the Epstein files right now. It's not necessarily that we have any evidence they engaged in any illegal sexual behavior with young people, but it's the fact they're hanging around with a convicted sex offender, Jeffrey Epstein, or just being around Jeffrey Epstein while he, for no reason, has all these young girls at his house. Again, not illegal to be there, but there's some ethical ick to it. This scandal, though, was covered a little bit in the news media at the time, and in a rare move, there was some bipartisan response in Congress. They passed a censure vote on both men, which is, kind of a harsh punishment back then. Today, Congress people don't really do as much work in committees, but back then they did a lot of work. So getting censured really felt like, kind of crippling your career. And this was they passed a bill that kind of changed some of the ethics around the ways in which pages were supposed to be approved and monitored. Crane eventually apologized and lost the next election. Studs refused to apologize for the nature of the relationship, calling it mutually voluntary. And although he did admit it was an error, he remained in office for another 14 years after that period went over as well. So this was kind of one of the first really mainstream ones. And I think I should point this out for historical context before I get your guys' take on this. But really prior to the 1980s and more so to the 1990s, there was this sort of belief in the press that one of the things that was off limits was people's private sex lives.
Mm.
And, obviously one of the biggest benefactors, that was probably JFK, but LBJ as well, who were having, competing with each other to have the most affairs. But the press knew about those, but they just thought you really shouldn't, report on them. And it's not really till Bill Clinton that the press gets pushed from two sides. One is the evangelical right, who's demanding this, the sanctity of marriage argument, and then this burgeoning feminist movement on the left that was demanding that these guys who are abusing their positions of power be held accountable. So this is kind of on the eve of that transition happening. So for a lot of these Congress people, they're shocked that the media is covering this at all for as little as it is. Although today it looks like basically no coverage at all. But what do you guys make of the 1983 Congressional Page Scandal?
Yeah, I actually was not familiar with this story, which is surprising because I remember in 2006 there was another Page scandal with a Republican, Mark Foley from Florida, and I just, I remember following that and finding, being compelled by that, and so I'm surprised that it wasn't brought up, or maybe I just I didn't find it the site my news articles or hear about it on my own. But so as I was looking into this a little bit more of this 1983 one, I was even reading an article that came out, and I think it was in the Times about covering the scandal, how it broke, and something that Sydney just had said previously about the the sort of dignity and the integrity of the sort of victims or the people who were abused, like that gets lost a little bit in our coverage. When I was reading this article about the New York Times, it sort of made me think a little bit about that that comment. There was it sort of seemed like the whole that this case was brought to the ethics committee to investigate after some pages had reported that there was widespread sexual misconduct happening. And there's a quote in this article from the head of the ethics committee who said that that it was reprimanding these two congressmen, it was important to do because the integrity of the institution at all times must be kept at a very high plane. And I just found it interesting that there was no mention of like, oh, maybe these there's an abuse of power against these pages, these young teenage or young adults who there was, I mean, I think Studs, who was the Democrat, he was very committed to the fact that it was a voluntary relationship that he had engaged in with the page, and he also, it was a homosexual relationship, which I think was a little bit controversial in the 80s. And then also I remember reading about how Studs was very critical of the U.S. Government policy in Latin America, and was not a fan of supplying arms and support to like the Contras. And so I was like, oh, maybe he was just an expendable person that you could throw under the bus, protect the integrity of the institution of Congress, and not really actually look at the abuse of power that's happening, and not really dig deeper and look at the systemic stuff, the structural stuff, and just.
And for folks who don't remember, the Iran-Contra scandal happened during the Reagan administration, and Congress had told Reagan it was illegal to send arms to the Contras down in Nicaragua. Well, they weren't in Nicaragua, but Nicaragua exiles. And he did anyways, and he was able to fund that by illegally sending arms to Iran through Israel in exchange for releasing hostages, while Iran was fighting Iraq, who we had also helped arm at the same time. And then this exploded into this big scandal. And so it was a big embarrassment for the Reagan administration and the United States. And so that's why I think you're right to point that out. I want to come back to Mark Foley, because I totally forgot about that. But Sydney, did you have something you want to say on this?